Today, let's learn about reflexes along with a topic called modifiable action pattern in ethology or animal behavior. So, reflex behavior is the simplest form of reaction to stimulation. It describes the rapid autonomic response of the body or part of body to a simple stimulus. Reflexes can be identified by following features. Reflexes are the simplest units of complex behavior. They are normally automatic, involuntary, and stereotyped. Stereotyped means to repeat an action without a variation. Unlike taxes, reflexes usually involve the movement of a part of body. They are not necessarily to be continuously guided by the stimulus. Reflexes are the outcome of the neural mechanism, therefore, they are innate in origin. They are innate in origin. Innate means existing in an individual's from birth. So that is the simplest form of complex behavior. Automatic reflex usually involves the movement of a part of body. They are not necessarily be continuously guided by the stimulus. Reflexes are the outcomes of neural mechanism are innate in origin. And a reflex action is directly proportional to the stimulus strength. Stronger the stimulus, shorter the latent period. Weaker the stimulus, longer the latent period. Latent period is defined as a time lag between the application of the stimulus and the observation of its effects. So let's look at the types of reflexes. Different reflexes can be grouped into following two types, which are the tonic reflexes. First one is the tonic reflexes. These are slow, long-lasting responses. They are involved in maintenance of the muscular tone, posture, and equilibrium adjustment. Tonic reflexes. Next comes the phasic reflexes. That is the next category. Phasic reflexes. These are fast, short-lived responses. They occur during flexion response of the body. There are two types of reflexes, which are the tonic reflexes and the phasic reflexes. Tonic reflex is the slow one, and that's this long-lasting response. And phasic reflexes are the short-lived responses. So the two types of reflexes include the tonic reflexes, which are slow and long-lasting responses. They are involved in maintenance of the muscular tone, posture, and equilibrium adjustment. And the phasic reflexes, these are the fast, short-lived responses. They occur during flexion response of the body. When we classify the reflexes in different types, a reflex may be nutritional, defensive, locomotor, etc. Besides tonic and phasic reflexes. These are the main types of reflexes, which are the exteroreceptor reflex. Exteroreceptor reflex is due to stimulation of receptors in the outside surface of body. And then the enteroreceptor reflexes. Enteroreceptor reflexes. It is due to the stimulation of receptors of the internal organs. Then comes the proprioreceptor reflexes. Proprioreceptor reflexes. First one was the exteroreceptor reflex, and then the enteroreceptor reflex, and then comes the proprioreceptor reflex. It is due to stimulation of receptors on the skeletal muscle joint and tendons. Proprioreceptor reflex is something which is happening due to stimulation of receptors on the skeletal muscle joint and tendons. Then comes the spinal or radial reflex. It depends on the part of central nerve system involved. And then the conditional reflex. These are those habits or involuntary activities which is due course of time become reflex actions like cycling, salivation, driving, swimming. All these are conditional reflexes. Then comes the unconditional reflexes. These are due to receptors involved and stimulus. These are normal reflex actions of the body, like contraction of the pupil of the eye in bright light, closure of eyelids, all those things which are represented by a term called unconditional reflexes. Now let's learn about the example of reflexes. The reflex action can be easily understood by a simple knee-jerk reflex. Simply a stimulus below kneecap or patella provokes spinal cord, which relays it through motor nerves to extensor muscles, causing them to contract. A reflex action, this is established with an overall effect of a kicking action. First, the knee jerk reflex is happening. A tap just below the patella cap, below knee cup, stimulates receptors in the tendon which send messages to the spinal cord. These are relayed to the motor nerves serving the extensor muscles which reflexively contract during a kicking action. Spinal cord is involved here and sensory neuron is also involved. Patella hammer is needed to produce that knee jerk reflex, and motor neuron tendon, muscle spindle, and a jerk action is created. Sometimes the whole animal may be involved in the reflex response. For example, the startle response of human require reflex coordinations of many muscles. Similarly, the reflex withdrawal response of invertebrates, reflex withdrawal response of invertebrates, reflex withdrawal, a response of invertebrates is something which is related to the withdrawal response, such as polychaete worms and various mollusks involve the whole body. Such reflexes of these invertebrates are triggered by giant nerve fibers that carry very fast messages to all muscles involved so that they contract suddenly and simultaneously. The whole animal may be involved in the reflex response. As an example, we can quote polychaete worms and various mollusks. So the happen a reflex withdrawal response of invertebrates. Okay. So here some giant nerve fibers are triggered. Reflex arc and its components. Now we are going to learn about a reflex arc. What is a reflex arc and its components? The nerve path traced by a reflex is known as a reflex arc. Reflex arc. A reflex arc involves the 5 neural components. The cell or group of cells acting as a sensory receptor. First one is a sensory receptor. An afferent or sensory neuron carrying impulses from the sense cells, then the effector or motor neuron carrying impulses to effector cells. An interneuron linking sensory and motor neurons are also there, and an effector organ like muscle or gland. All this comes under the term called the reflex arc. The reflex arc for the knee jerk is rather special. Instead of connecting with an interneuron in the spinal cord, the sensory neuron connects directly with the motor neuron. Here is a interneuron is absent. The knee jerk reflex therefore forms a monosynaptic arc. It contains a single synapse, a type more typical of invertebrate nerve system. Monosynaptic arc. In case of knee jerk reflex, we can see a monosynaptic arc. Monosynaptic arc. Okay. When a limb is pulled away from a painful stimulus, it involves somewhat more complex reflex. In this case, the passage of impulses from sensory to motor neuron is mediated by a mass of interneurons called association neurons. Association neurons are also present in case of a limb withdrawal reflex. When a painful sensation happens, limbs are pulled away from the painful stimulus. So here there is an interneuron which is called as the association neuron. Okay, which is situated in the spinal cord. Such a reflex is termed as a polysynaptic. Earlier, we have learned a term called monosynaptic arc where the interneuron was absent, but here the polysynaptic polysynaptic neurons polysynaptic arc is present, which involves an interneuron or association neurons. Now let's learn about the physiological characteristics of reflex arcs. First one is the latency. In a reflex arc, there is usually a latency in response. For example, when a dog withdraws its paw from a painful stimulus, the response should occur within 27 seconds if the only limiting factor is the speed of impulse conduction through appropriate neurons. In fact, the response does not appear for about 60 to 200 seconds. The reason for the delay is the number of synaptic junctions the impulse has to traverse. However, the latency of the reflex decreases with increased strength of stimulus. This is important because reflexes are designed to act in emergencies. When the strength of the stimulus increases, the latency of reflex decreases because there exists an emergency condition. After contraction of muscles, normally the muscle reflexes a few seconds after stimulation ceases. If contraction is elicited through a reflex arc, it must persist for several seconds after stimulus occasion. The duration and strength of its after contraction of muscle is positively related to the strength of the stimulus. First point was the physiological characteristics of reflex arcs. First point was the latency in the neural reflex arc. Next one is the after contraction of muscles. The next point is the summation and warm-up effect. Among the other integrating properties, the CNS is able to accumulate repeated stimuli over time. That is called as the temporal summation from different parts of the body, which is called as the spatial summation. The scratch reflex of the dog provides good example of summation. A dog shows a scratching response with its hind limb if an irritating stimulus is applied to certain areas of its back. If the stimulus is weak, scratching may not occur until after 20 or more applications. The CNS summates the irritations over the time they are applied. In this way, summation may lead to another characteristic of reflexes and the warm-up effect. Reflexes then do not occur in full strength until a stimulus has been applied several times. Such warm-up effect, well known in various mobbing and courtship activities. Reflexes where the warm-up effect occurs. It seems that successive stimulation brings more motor neurons into play, thus producing a stronger reaction. This is known as motor recruitment. Now let's learn about fatigue. Reflexes show high-end effective fatigue. Normally, a muscle stimulated to contract remains responsively active for several hours. But if the muscle is stimulated by a reflex arc, its response declines very rapidly. In some cases, as the scratch reflex in the dog, response lasts only about 20 seconds. What appears to happen is that with repeated stimulation, the interneurons in the CNS begin to block impulse transmission by increasing the resistance of their synaptic junctions. A stronger or qualitatively different stimulus, however, will soon re-establish a fatigue reflex. There happens a fatigued reflex. Now let's learn about the neurophysiology of reflex. Reflexes are organized at different neural levels, from the spinal cord to the brain. For example, simple flexion or extension reflexes are achieved at spinal cord, and the locomotion and other mechanisms in our body are the functions of brain. So in general, the reflexes involve two control processes, one at central level and the other at peripheral level. First control process happening at the central level, next one on the peripheral level. Okay. In the case of the central control, precise instructions are issued by the brain and are obeyed by all the muscles or organs involved. The coordination of swallowing movements in mammal is under central control. What is happening here? The instructions issued by the brain are obeyed by all the muscles or organs involved. That is happening in the central control. Swallowing is the example. Swallowing movements in mammals is under central control. Central control is important in the coordination of many skilled movements which require rapid muscular activity, like movement of eyeball, all this. And central control is also operative in prey catching by cuttlefish or sepia. When control center stimulates the extraocular muscle control system by a motor outflow, eyeball is stimulated, then a load or position is happening. But in case of the movement of limb, that is under peripheral control. So control center is there, which stimulates the limb muscle control system through the motor outflow. Limb is moving and position and load is also applied. The position is actually have a control on the control center, that is joint receptors are also there. The peripheral control of reflex is attained through sensory and muscular system. For example, peripheral control is important in the movement of limbs because these are often subjected to loads. Displacement of limb position is monitored by sensory receptors and feedback to the central control center, and the displacement is corrected. In case of peripheral control of reflexes, that is attained through sensory and muscular system. For example, peripheral control is important in the movement of limbs because they are often subjected to loads. Displacement of limb position is monitored by sensory receptors and feedback to the central control center, and the displacement is corrected. Now, let's learn about the open loop and closed loop models of reflexes. Manning and Dawkins in 1998 describes two models of the control mechanism, the open loop and the closed loop models. First one is the open loop model. It has no monitor and input coming to behavioral system is interacted and we get the output or response. Even if output is subjected to some disturbance, it is not going to affect the behavioral system. In this case, output and input are not closely interlinked. In case of open loop model. First one is the open loop model and then the closed loop model. Closed loop model, what is happening in the closed loop model? In this case, any alteration in the output feeds back to the input to affect the behavior system and thus changes the output. Thus, the change is proportional to the change done in behavior system by disturbance. Open loop system seems to operate when responses are rapid, while closed loop system works during slow and precise movements. When two reflex target the same organ, in this situation both become incompatible neurologically. One of them tries to inhibit the performance of the other. This is known as inhibition. Inhibition brings a greater coordination between the different responses in animals, and here we can see a picture of the two models of reflex mechanism. Input, behavioral system, disturbance is happening and then output is released. But in case of second one, input represented instruction of input and feedback effect is happening, and feedback system is involved in case of closed loop system. behavior system is disturbance is happening and output is released. In case of open loop system, no monitor and input coming to behavioral system is interacted and we get the output or response. Even if output is subjected to some disturbance, it is not going to affect the behavioral system. That means output and input are not closely interlinked in case of open loop model. But in closed loop model, alteration in the output feeds back to the input to affect the behavioral system and thus changes the output. Thus the change is proportional to the change done in behavioral system by disturbance. And two reflexes target the same organ, there occurs a phenomenon called as the inhibition. Now let's restart learning about reflexes afresh. So just see this as a quick summary of reflex, but we will be explaining a greater amount of points here too. So reflexes and reflex actions. Reflexes are very similar to taxes because they are relatively stereotyped and fixed responses, almost invariable to stimuli that come under the definition of innate behavior in the sense that they are the outcomes of inherited neural mechanisms. It is generally seen that taxes involve an orientation of the whole body that may involve a number of specific reflex responses. A reflex like the startle reflex to agitate suddenly by a shock or surprise or alarm, or writing reflex may involve all or most of the body, but typically they are responses of part of the body, like the reflexes of a leg in response to painful stimuli or the constriction of a pupil to intense light. Reflexes may occur at different levels of nerve system, brain level or spinal cord level, and occur in various degrees of complexity. The complex reflexes depend on the higher segments of the nerve system. In vertebrates, simple flexion and extension reflexes like stepping may be organized within a few segments of the spinal cord. But in case of locomotion, that is the alteration of flexion and extension, it is organized by many segments of the spinal cord and required the influence of the midbrain. It is worthwhile to mention here that the sense organs such as muscle spindles or light detectors are usually directly linked to specific reflex mechanisms. They send messages to brain or to more peripheral parts of the central nervous system such as spinal cord or vertebrates. Instructions are then sent to the effector organs like muscles or glands. This complete circuit forms the reflex arc, and the function of reflex arc is a reflex behavior. In the reflex behavior, basic physiological mechanisms are quite complex. To explain all this, in 1906, Sir Charles Sherrington published his studies on spinal reflexes in the integrative action of the nervous system. In his book, he considered the way in which reflexes operate and how the central nervous system integrates them into adaptive behavior, combining information gathering from different sources and arranging sequences of action. Now let's learn about the laws of the reflex by Sherrington in 1906 by the book The Integrative Action of the Nerve System. Sherrington described important features common to different reflexes such as the following. Threshold. As we know that the reflex is elicited by a stimulus on the surface of body, maybe a pinch, a prick, a hot object, or an electrical, chemical, or mechanical shock. If, for example, a weak shock is given to the foot pad of the spinal dog, what is a spinal dog? Central nervous system is cut so that most of the brain is separated from the spinal cord. In case of a spinal dog, central nervous system is cut so that most of the brain is separated from the spinal cord and it does not show any response. No responses are produced. But if the intensity of the stimulus is raised step by step, a point is suddenly reached where the response follows each stimulus. Now it may be called that the stimulus intensity has reached threshold for eliciting the reflex. Stimulus intensity, we are talking about the first point or the loss of reflex, that is the threshold. So when a spinal dog is weak shock is given to its foot pad, the stimulus intensity has reached threshold for eliciting the reflex. Next one is the reflex latency. This simply means that there is a delay between giving a stimulus and seeing its effects. There is a delay between giving a stimulus and seeing its effects. Sherrington calculated that allowing time for conduction along axons, the dog flexion reflex in which it withdraws its legs is in response to a painful stimuli, the minimum latency is about 22 milliseconds. 1 millisecond is about 0.001 second. So that is what 1 second is millisecond. 1 millisecond is equal to 0.01 second. So the minimum latency is about 22 milliseconds. The shortest reflex latencies occur when strong stimuli are applied. The same reflex will have a longer latency when the stimulus is less intense. The extent of flexion reflex in dog with 3 strengths of stimulus. Now next one is the irradiation. The irradiation is defined as the increase in the extent of the response with an increase in stimulus strength. Example, a man who touches a hot stove withdraws the finger or perhaps the hand. If the stove is very hot, the entire arm is pulled back. If it is red hot, the person springs backwards, usually crying, and pulls the entire body away from the danger. The another example of irradiation can be given of an animal, example a cat, with a transaction of the midbrain to show how excitation spreads through the central nervous system when the stimulus intensity is increased. In this case, a main stimulus to the left hind leg causes a withdrawal of the leg. If the stimulus is sufficiently intense, the right foreleg is also flexed, so the animal assumes the position of the forelimbs in such a way as if walking or running. Next one is the after discharge. The continuation of response after the end of the stimulus is called after discharge. Continuation of the response after the end of the stimulus is called after discharge. As in case of dog, a painful stimulus to the foot pad causes withdrawal of the leg, but when the stimulus is stopped, the leg gradually returns to its normal position. Hence, the effect of the stimulus persists in some way within the animal long after the application of stimulus is over. In case of irradiation, a spinal cat is in a usual position, but the left hind paw receives a strong stimulus, resulting in its flexion, and at the same time the right forelimb is extended. That is something which is explained by irradiation. After discharge is something which involves the continuation of response after the end of the stimulus. Now let's learn about the rhythmic response. Rhythmic response. This can be explained by scratch reflex, example of dog. A reflex elicited by rubbing or scraping by some sharp or rough object. The scratch reflex can also be elicited by an electrical shock to the skin on the dog's back. Even with the shock is given 500 times per second, the response is rhythmic scratching motion by the hind leg. The leg moves back and forth 4 times per second. Further, it is also seen that the scratching movements are directed towards the point being stimulated. The directing of the movement towards the stimulus is called as the local sign. Now let's learn about the next topic, that is the summation. The scratch reflex described below can also illustrate another law of reflex, the summation. The stimuli summed in time. With 5 to 10 weak stimuli given in rapid succession, may not evoke any response. Sub-threshold stimulus applied. The scratch reflex is evoked only after 44 stimuli have been given. The stimuli are added up in the animal until a threshold is reached. This is called temporal summation. And another type of summation is produced by giving several sub-threshold stimuli simultaneously at several different points on the skin and then applied together. The animal evoked the response. This is known as spatial summation. First one was the temporal summation, and the next one was the spatial summation. What is a spatial summation? And another type of summation is produced by giving several sub-threshold stimuli simultaneously at different points in the skin, and when applied all together, the stimuli evoke the response. This is known as the spatial summation. But in case of temporal summation, the scratch reflex is evoked only after 44 stimuli have been given. The stimuli are added up in the animal until a threshold is reached. That is called as the temporal summation. And if the stimuli is distributed in the whole body in different points, that is called as the spatial summation. All these are types of summation where the reflex is produced only after reaching a threshold level. Okay, next one is the warm up. Sherrington showed that warm up in some reflex is due to the summation of stimuli which evoke a response from more and more motor nerve fibers, producing stronger contraction. He regarded this phenomenon as motor recruitment, that is called as the motor recruitment. Warm-up in some reflexes is due to the summation of stimuli which evoke a response from more and more motor nerve fibers, producing stronger contraction. This is known as the motor recruitment. Now let's learn about the fatigue. Sherrington found that dog scratch reflex response becomes weaker and weaker after about 20 seconds of continuous mechanical or electrical stimulation at a single point of skin. The movement of the leg become weaker and lost their rhythm. It appears to show that if it is in fatigue, but this fatigue is not found due to muscles, because if the same muscles are stimulated, the flexion reflex appears at full strength. Sherrington believed that it was caused by increased resistance to transmission across the synapses between the internuncial neurons, which convey impulses down the spinal cord and the motor neurons. This means that fatigue lies somewhere between the sense organs in the skin and the origin of motor nerve. Next one is the inhibition. So which are the main points? Like the loss of reflex threshold, reflex latency, irradiation, after discharge, rhythmic response, summation, warm-up and fatigue, along with inhibition. So now we are going to learn about inhibition, which are the laws of reflex threshold, reflex latency, irradiation, after discharge, rhythmic response and summation, along with warm-up, fatigue and inhibition. Inhibition, Sherrington demonstrated that sometimes impulses passing along axons inhibit transmission by the nerve cell with which they synapse, though it is receiving excitatory impulses from the axon. Delay and fatigue also partly cause inhibition. It is interesting to note that when the flexions of one limb are contracting, the flexions of the opposite limb are inhibited. That is reciprocal inhibition. Active inhibition can easily be distinguishable from fatigue. As we have seen in the example of fatigue, in case of scratch reflex, it is marked by a gradual weakening. When the same reflex is inhibited by stimulating the antagonistic flexion reflex, it stops abruptly and starts again on removal of flexion stimulus. Active inhibition can easily be distinguished from fatigue. As we have seen in the example of fatigue, in case of scratch reflex, it is marked by a gradual weakening. When the same reflex is inhibited by stimulating the antagonistic flexion reflex, it stops abruptly and starts again on removal of flexion stimulus. Therefore, inhibition serves to bring out a smooth and rapid transition from one reflex action to the other. From the above, it is concluded that reflexes are also innate sensory motor responses, usually of a part of the body. These are seen in all metazoa. These are determined by receptor properties and central neural connections. As learning capacity develops in the animal kingdom, that may readily be modified. Reflexes are also innate sensory motor responses, usually of a part of the body. These are seen in all metazoa. These are determined by receptor properties and central neural connections. As learning capacity develops in the animal kingdom, that may readily be modified. Now let's learn about the classification of the reflex. Reflex acts or reflexes can be classified into various groups using various parameters. This can be following types based on either biological importance, receptors stimulated, parts of the nervous system induced, or functions. Reflexes on the basis of biological importance of the functions produced. This may be called nutritional, defensive, sexual, postural, and locomotor. These are the reflexes on the basis of biological importance, which are the nutritional, defensive, sexual, postural, and locomotor. Reflexes based on the type of receptors stimulated. Exteroceptive receptors by stimulation of the receptor on the outer surface of the body. That is what is called as the exteroceptive. Now, interoceptive by stimulation of the receptors situated in the internal organs, while the pH receptors, glucostats, scratch receptors, osmoreceptors, etc. comes under the interoceptive category. Now the proprioceptive one, by stimulation of the receptors of muscle, joints and tendons. Reflexes based on the parts of CNS involved. Spinal one, that is the neurons of spinal cord are involved. Then the bulbar one, neurons of medulla oblongata are involved. Then the mesencephalic one, where the neurons of midbrain are involved. Then comes the diencephalic one, where the neurons of thalamus and hypothalamus are involved. Then comes the cortical one, when neurons and cerebral cortex are involved. Now, reflexes based on functions. Motor reflexes when effector organ is muscle, and secretory reflex, secretion by gland occurs, and vasomotor, heat or vessels are involved. Increase or decrease in heart rate, contraction or relaxation of vessels, etc. are happening in case of vasomotor one. All the reflex activities of an organism can be broadly grouped into the following 4 categories. Wait a minute. Reflexes based on the functions was motor reflex, secretory reflex, and the vasomotor reflex. Vasomotor reflex is something related with heart or vessels, and increase or decrease in heart rate, contraction or relaxation of vessels are also involved in case of vasomotor reflexes. Then the next one is the unconditional reflex. Inborn reflexes or instincts transmitted through heredity, pupillary swallowing, tendon flexions, etc. These are evoked by a definite stimulus and are constant. but conditioned reflexes are acquired or learned reflexes during the lifetime. They are not constant and may disappear or reappear again. Then comes the tonic reflexes. These are relatively slow, long-lasting adjustments that maintain muscular tone, posture, and equilibrium. Then comes the phasic reflexes. These are rapid, short-lived adjustments like the flexion response. Now let's learn about the next topic, that is the modifiable action patterns. There are some innate behaviors which are basically fixed action patterns but are still modifiable by different types of learning processes or experience. Learning is one of biology's most tantalizing problems and one that still contains many mysteries. And that is something which is explained by modifiable action patterns. This is some sort of innate behaviors which are basically fixed action patterns but are still modifiable by different types of learning process or experience.